So once again, I'm Jeff Walker, the Executive Administrator of the Water Development Board. I want to welcome y'all here. Hope you've been enjoying the conference so far. It's only just begun. We still got several sessions to go. So if you hadn't noticed, the theme of this conference is the story of Texas water, past, present, and future. And if you noticed, I've noticed in several of the breakout sessions, and even the big ones, people keep asking, how do I tell the story of raising my rates? How do I tell the story of the value of water? How do I tell the story of fill in the blank? Well, you're in luck. So I've been looking forward to this panel since we started this conference. This is one of the keynote panels that we were dead set on having. It is so critical for all of us in the water industry to preach the gospel of water. Why is it something that we literally cannot live without causing so much consternation for paying for it? Our moderator on this panel, How Do You Tell the Story of Texas Water, is Bill McKenzie, current editorial director of the George W. Bush Institute. Before he landed what I would consider the job of a lifetime, he did a few other things like win a Pulitzer Prize at Dallas Morning News. So without further ado, Bill McKenzie. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the first thing I would ask is raise your hand if you can't hear me, because I do have a soft voice, and if you can't hear me from this side particularly, raise your hand, and so don't hesitate. So I'm honored to be joined by a number of people who have been involved in both journalism, and water and environment, ecological issues, which my own 2 cents are just so very important, obviously to our country, but particularly to our state. I was privileged to write about them a good bit when I was on the editorial page with the Dallas Morning News. My friend Bill Mulligan is here in the audience, and we spent many hours on the telephone talking about these issues. I concede right up front, it is sometimes difficult, not sometimes, it's often difficult to get the public's attention on this issue. We will hammer some of this out here. Oftentimes, I cited a colleague on the editorial page, said, why do you write about this? Why do you care? You just turn the tap on and water comes out. Why should I worry? So we'll address some of that here. And I couldn't argue with you. Turn the tap on and the water comes out, but it may not in the future. So immediately to my left is Rich Oppel, who's the interim editor-in-chief of Texas Monthly, a absolutely wonderful publication, which I'm sure many and most of you read and know about. Rich also was previously editor of the Austin American-Statesman from 1995 through 2008. Before that, he was with the Charlotte Observer, also as editor from 78 to 93, and during that time, the Observer won 3 Pulitzers. He previously served on the Pulitzer board and was president of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. He's also served as the Knight Ridder Washington Bureau Chief, taught journalism here in Austin at Houston-Tillotson, where he also, I was really impressed with this, was involved in helping develop a community center to provide medical care for low-income residents. So, and a graduate at the University of South Florida. So, Rich, thank you.
Thank you.
So, and to his left is Corrie MacLaggan. Yes. All right, I've been working on that. And a fellow Scott, who is the Texas Tribune's managing editor. I also, as with Texas Monthly, I'm sure many of you here read Texas Tribune. In my estimation, it is one of the most exciting models in digital journalism in the country, not just obviously in our state. Water is a topic that they cover closely. I've followed and read it for a long time. They also, I was impressed with this, have a journalism student who's reporting as a water fellow. I think that's a great way to draw upon the expertise of people, particularly younger people, to bring into this profession. Corrie previously, she's an Austin native, worked as a national correspondent for Reuters, and has covered Texas government and politics for The Statesman, lived in Mexico City, where she wrote from there for a number of publications, and is a University of North Carolina grad. Stacy Chesney is managing editor of TAP, which I strongly encourage you to look at, is a very creative website that explains Colorado water issues, Denver water issues, and I look forward to learning more about this. I really found it very interesting. She's manager of media communications for Denver Water, and where she edits stories and handles media inquiries and the like, and oversees Denver Water's social media channels. She's from the Chicago area, has a bachelor's in communications from Northwestern, and a graduate and certificate in PR marketing from the University of Denver. And to her left is Asher Price, who's an environmental reporter here for the Statesman. He has written extensively about water, environment, and energy issues there. He's been 3 times nominated as a finalist for the Society Environmental Journalist Beat Reporter of the Year. I'd love to hear more about this at a different time. He's author of Year of the Dunk, a memoir about basketball, cancer, and the frontiers of human potential. I think we'll have our own panel on that afterward. He is co-author of The Great Texas Wind Rush, about how the oil and gas state become the nation's top producer of wind power. I also see you have a biography of Earl Campbell coming out.
It's coming out in the fall, yeah.
Excellent. I was a UT student during the Earl Campbell years.
Oh, great.
So he's a Yale graduate and has a graduate degree in public policy and journalism. So thank you all. What we're going to do is open up with I've asked them to give us 3 to 5 minutes on how they got involved with the water issues, or their publication is involved with water issues, and to give some background on their story with water, and also why they think this matters. And we will also get into a number of questions. After that, at the end, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions from you all. So Rich, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And I'm delighted to be here. This is an impressive group. Let me talk a little bit about Texas Monthly first. We're somewhat different from other media you may be dealing with, but we're the folks who we don't do much breaking news, not in print anyway. We step back, take our time, look at things, dive deep, write very long stories often, and publish 3 to 4 months, maybe a year after an event has rippled the surface of news. We have about 270,000 print circulation, but now we've gone, as others have done, to kind of a cross-platform format where we have digital. So we are interested in hearing from you on breaking news. Contact us. We have a very active website, texasmonthly.com, and we love to hear from you. What I recommend doing is looking at our website and at the magazine, picking up on the writers, those who you may identify with, then contacting them by email. Letter of the first name, and then last name, like R. Oppel at texasmonthly.com. We'll get back with you on that. But back to print. The last time we dove deep on water, although there have been quite a few stories that have involved water issues since then, was July 2012, when we produced this magazine called, and the package was called The Last Drop. This was 30 pages on this one subject. And our approach to that, I wanted to give you a sense of the components so you understand, in a sense, how we look at things. First was kind of a call to action by the editor, who at that time was Jake Silverstein. And he wrote the opening calling on the ingenuity of Texans to ensure a steady water supply for years to come. Then he followed up with a symposium at the LBJ School and a documentary produced with KUT. The second piece within the magazine was by Roger Hodge, which was a kind of a context piece looking at water and drought for what we know today as Texas going back 4,000 years. The third piece was NPR's John Burnett assembling for us an oral history about the drought of the 1950s. And he did what we try to do always, and that is include very vivid Texas characters and personalities. In this case, people like Boob Kelton of Upton County, Mort Mertz from San Angelo, sheep ranchers, goat raisers, a guy by the name of Preston Wright, who's 90 years old, of Junction, and so on. All of these became well-developed characters in this package of stories. Fourth, we traveled the state with the state photographer, Wyman Meinzer, who shot some extraordinary pictures for us. Dry rivers, dying cattle, thirsty deer stalked by predators. A fifth piece was Nate Blakeslee's digging deep into the state's latest water plan, which included at that time $53 billion in new reservoirs, treatment plants, and other projects. He observed that the plan was directionless and balkanized, reflecting distribution determined ultimately by the endless scramble of interest that underlies any policy debate over a finite resource. I'm sure things have changed with the water plan since then. Six, Kate Galbraith wrote about the necessity for Texas's municipalities, power plants, and factories to come together to figure out how to cope with a hotter, drier climate. As she put it, the Texas miracle might disappear in a cloud of dust. A pivotal figure in her story was John Nielsen Gammon, the state climatologist. So that's how we look at it, 5,000 to 15,000 words if it's a one article piece, or it could be 30,000 words or 50,000 words, book length approach. The arc of the narrative, the long narrative, very specific scene setting, sequels, parts to the story, and very colorful characters. We're part news, we're part entertainment. We like to think of our readers as picking up the magazine because they enjoy reading it and they're sitting with a cup of coffee by the fireside and making a go of it for a couple of hours. It's a little different than what my colleagues do, but that's Texas Monthly. Thank you.
Terrific. And if I may, I'll hold up this copy called The Last Drop, which was their special issue on water, and I remember it well and reading it. So it also gives you a chance when you come away from there, you, in a real person language, understand more about what was going and what is going on in the state and water. So Corrie, give us your story.
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me. I'll tell you a little bit about the Texas Tribune. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization. We were founded 10 years ago, and we focus on Texas government and politics and policy. And civic education is really a mission for us. So we know that this state is really fast growing. We have 6 of the 20 biggest cities in the country. There's a lot at stake. And we believe that a smarter Texas is a better Texas. We're based in Austin, and most of our reporters are over at the Texas Capitol this spring covering the legislative session. We also have a reporter in Dallas, a reporter in El Paso, and we have a Washington, D.C. bureau that covers the Texas congressional delegation. We cover all kinds of policy areas: healthcare, education, immigration, criminal justice, energy, and the environment. And water is a very big part of our environmental coverage. We cover all kinds of water issues, from drought to flooding, water legislation, water politics, infrastructure, and supply. We tell stories through videos, podcasts, live events, as well as more traditional text stories. We do breaking news and also longer-term stories. In 2018, we published more than 50 stories about water. So one of the most popular water stories of ours last year was about the boil water notice here in Austin. The Statesman also covered that a lot. And then a lot of our water stories last year were about Hurricane Harvey's aftermath. Some of our water stories are not quite as popular as stories about things like medical marijuana or the debate between Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke, but we still feel that they are very important stories to cover. We give away all of our stories for free to other news organizations, and so our stories about water appear on the front pages of newspapers like the Amarillo Globe News. They've been on online news organizations' websites like Houston Public Media, the El Paso Business Journal. Our stories are in the Corpus Christi Caller-Times. So we see our stories go farther than just our website. So last year, our Hurricane Harvey aftermath coverage included stories about a Harris County bond measure for flood control, the impact of Harvey on congressional races in the Houston area, what life was like for people in Rockport, Texas, a year after Harvey, when a lot of them still didn't have a place to live. And we also had a day-long symposium on rebuilding the coast after Harvey. That symposium was in Corpus Christi. So other stories from last year, just to give you an example, we had a story about a water fight between Texas and New Mexico, where New Mexico officials were accusing Texas landowners of stealing millions of gallons of water and selling it back for fracking. We had our reporter Jay Root traveled to the Texas-New Mexico border for that and talked with ranchers and farmers and elected officials, also brought a photographer. Another story from last year was about how drought was returning to Texas after just months after Harvey had flooded the state. And so we had maps showing the drought in different parts of Texas for each month following Harvey. Several times a year we publish big investigative projects, and in 2016 one of those projects focused on water. It was called Hell and High Water: How Houston's Next Big Storm Could Cripple America. And we published it in partnership with two other news organizations, ProPublica and Reveal. It was an interactive look at the terrible consequences a Katrina-like hurricane might have on Houston. And a follow-up report later in 2016 called Boomtown, Floodtown explained how Houston was at risk for major flooding and had not properly prepared. And this was all published before Hurricane Harvey. That project included storm simulations based on complex data models, deeply reported stories, beautiful photography, and a lookup tool where if you were a reader who lived in Houston, you could type in your address and see how your home may be affected. It sparked immediate results, including legislation in Congress, and it won a Peabody, which is the nation's top honor for multimedia storytelling.
So thank you. I think one thing to bear in mind as you all listen to this, what strikes me is the multimedia aspect of what you all do and so many institutions are doing today. It's no longer just a, obviously, traditional newspaper, but it's multimedia.
That's right.
Which we're getting ready to hear from with Stacy. So
right.
Thank you.
Yeah, so just a little bit of background on Denver Water. We are a municipal water agency serving Denver and many surrounding suburbs in Colorado. We serve about a quarter of the state's population. That's 1.4 million people in that area. But we also have a pretty big statewide impact. Our water supply, we're a surface water supply system, so really that mountain snowmelt is what's feeding us, and so you can imagine from year to year basis that can come into play with scarcity. And we draw from the South Platte and Colorado River basins. We're also the third largest landowner in the state. We have facilities in 10 counties, more than 10 counties across the state, and so we really have a statewide impact. And that some of those, there's conflicts that come with that. We bring water from the west slope to feed the cities in the east slope, and there's some inherent conflict on bringing water across the divide in that sense of things. So as we plan 50 years out into the future, and the challenges we face as a utility are probably very similar to what you're talking about here in Texas. We're looking at growth. We're looking at the uncertainties and extremities that come with climate change, more droughts and more flooding more frequently. The crisis along the Colorado River Basin is an important issue to us, as is investing in infrastructure. So that's why this topic of communication and communicating the value of water is really important to us. Last year, we celebrated our 100th anniversary, and as I reflect back, was thinking about, for a good portion of those 100 years, we as a utility really didn't do a lot of proactive communication. We didn't really need to. We were selling water, we sent people a bill, they paid us, we were able to develop the supply we needed. But then we had a couple of important wake-up calls, really starting in the 90s. There was a veto of one of the big dam projects that we were looking to do. And then in 2002, there was a really extreme drought. And we learned that coming out of that, we really needed to communicate the importance of water conservation and efficiency in a way that people kind of knew what to do and that captured people's attention. And so sort of fast forward to today where we're at, I've been at Denver Water more than 10 years, the majority of which I've spent managing that media relations component. And what struck me is how much communication has changed over that past decade. People are getting information in so many different ways, whether it's social media, maybe they're reading the paper, maybe they're not, and how do we reach them At the same time, the news landscape has shifted for us. We used to be a 2-newspaper town. One of them closed a number of years ago, so we're 1 newspaper. We've got 5 different TV stations, but they're all kind of being asked to do more with less. So what I saw was an opportunity to kind of create our own content and help fill that void and provide some of that content so we can reach people directly, as well as provide the news outlets we work with videos and stories and information. And so we did launch our website TAP in 2017, and it's been really successful in helping us stay ahead of topics and lead with our own story, and also helping us provide content to the media. And I can talk more on the different ways in which we're doing that, but that's where I'll leave it.
As I said, it's really a very informative site. In preparation for this panel, I went to it and I was reading a lot of the pieces you all put up there, and it was informative and very well done. And I'd be curious as we're going who reads that and what that audience might be like.
Great.
Asher? You've been at this-
First of all, can everybody hear me fine? Yes, okay, great. Thanks for having me. And I also just, it's really wonderful to be on a panel, especially with Rich and Corrie. Rich hired me at the Statesman in 2004 as a cub reporter. And Corrie has long been a colleague and valued friend. And both Rich and Corrie are wonderful human beings as well as journalists. And so Bill and
They're not
Stacy,
mutually exclusive, but go ahead.
yeah, Bill and Stacy might be wonderful human beings as well, but I can't
We don't
vouch for
know.
them. So I would just say a few things. First of all, I personally grew up in New York City on the 10th floor of an apartment building, and so I was disconnected from the source of water. It was something that came out of my tap, or when the toilet was flushed and so on. And so it wasn't something I was particularly interested in, and that goes for questions of other environmental issues like wildlife and. Other than pigeons in Central Park, cockroaches in the kitchen. I didn't know about critters. And a few years after getting to the newspaper, the Statesman, the environmental reporting job opened up, and my editors asked me if I was interested in taking it on. And my first thought was, no, I'm not really interested in the environment. But I went out to lunch with a colleague of ours, Ralph Horowitz, who he covers higher ed stuff now at the newspaper, but he had the environmental beat in the 90s, and he said, whatever it is you're interested in, issues of race, politics, urban planning, they intersect with environmental and water issues. And one way to think about the beat is think about the water beat, the environmental beat, is to think about it in that context. And this seemed like sage advice, and has actually proven accurate. So I became the environmental reporter, and actually I think it speaks well of the Statesman, just as it does of the Tribune, and as it has at Texas Monthly, that we devote a lot of time and resources to things like water and the environment. And the way I come at the beat is partly just as I described. I'm interested in not necessarily in water issues in and of themselves, but how they interplay with other things that go on in our lives. I also, because this is a capital town, I see part of my role is to illuminate the relationship between money and power and politics and water, as well as other environmental issues. But I also, there's another part of our beat. I mean, again, Rich and Corrie alluded to this kind of coverage at their own places, at their own news organizations. But getting out in the field, I like to think of myself as a foreign correspondent. So if I'm writing back for an audience here in Austin about fascinating people or places, and regardless of what the story is, whether it's that kind of story or the kind of story I was talking about a minute ago about trying to illuminate something, when I try to figure out whether to write about something, and when I'm in my conversation with my editor about whether to write about something, I'm interested in what kind of broader truths this story is about. In other words, okay, here I'm writing about this specific person and this, water issue, the veto of the project that Denver wanted. But what does it say more broadly about the politics of the Colorado, governor and legislature and so on? Of course, here in Texas, that's what I'd be interested in. So anyway, thanks again for having me here.
You bet. So I'm going to give this to you all as kind of a jump ball. You can answer this one. You can spin it flat, round, which way you want to. You can figure out which side of the question you want to answer. So on the negative side, the question I have in mind is, so what would it take to get people to pay more attention to some of these, to water issues? We've talked about droughts. We've talked about floods. You talked about hurricanes. On the other hand, it's not as exciting to read about funding the state water plan, without which we're not going to take care of the population in the future. So what's it take to get people to read about this? Or more positively, am I wrong in that people really do engage with some of these issues without being prompted by a catastrophe? Jump ball for whoever wants to answer.
What I would say is when you want to get a story out, don't think so much about your own organization or your clients or colleagues. Think about the ultimate reader. Don't think about me or Corrie or Asher. Think about the consumer of the media that we represent, and then bring it down to very personal terms. Why can't I use my lawn sprinkler? Why is my water bill $329 this past month? And then third, think in terms of, a lot of the stories we publish can be fairly sad, dreary stories, and in the aggregate, people come away from the morning newspaper or magazine feeling kind of dejected, some anxiety about what's going on in the world or nation. So think in terms of solutions to problems, opportunities, outcomes that have some kind of gratification to them.
I think if you want to get people interested in water stories, you have to tell stories about people. And there's a lot of great water stories that are also people stories. So, when we wrote last year about a proposed reservoir in North Texas, what we did is we talked to the people who lived on the land that was going to be flooded to make the reservoir. And that is probably a more interesting way to approach that particular story for the reader than talking about SWIFT and how the reservoir was going to be financed. No offense to the Texas Water Development Board, but just approaching it from a people perspective. I am reading a novel right now called The Overstory. Has anyone read it? It's by Richard Powers. It's really great. It is a novel about trees, and it's about this beautiful world of trees. But he hooks you in by telling stories about people, and I think we can do the same in journalism.
Absolutely. Just to kind of build on that, when we launched TAP, we really said to ourselves, look, this is not a housing place for news releases. This is not marketing speak. We really are trying to tell those stories that are going to resonate with people and get them in what matters to them. And so it's not going to work, and news stations aren't going to use our content if we're just promoting ourselves. So that was really a big challenge to ourselves. And then I think just trying to also think outside of the box when you can. For us, we look at visual graphic ways to tell stories, and I know news sites do that as well, but is there an infographic that can tell this in a more compelling way? Can we make a little animation to draw this for people so they visually get what we're talking about? And so tapping into those types of things, thinking outside the box can be really fun. I'll give a little plug. One of our people who was really into The Walking Dead and zombies, she said, well, what if I want to do something that ties to this? And so she made it real and relevant. It was what to do if all hell breaks loose and you can't get to water in your home. Where do you find resources in your house? And so she used zombies in an infographic but it was yes, in a crisis, you can, actually use the toilet tank if you boiled that water and do it. And it was really creative. So sometimes stretch yourself and think outside the box and you can come up with really successful ideas. I
agree with everything everyone here said. I just add a couple things. First, I think drought does matter. I mean, for sharpening people's attention. So I think that's definitely true, and I think that's probably something that's true of the kind of water marketing that goes on too. When whether you're trying to get a Water for Texas campaign going, if there's a water calamity, then people are more likely to be attuned to that they can relate to in their everyday life. Also, from a storytelling standpoint, sometimes it helps to lay out winners and losers for readers. So that's something to think about as well if you're pitching a story to a reporter. Is okay, you might be interested in promoting this. What are the forces arrayed against you, and just describe that tension for me a little bit. I think that's all I have.
All right. So have any of you all been surprised to the extent to which people do pay attention to water issues? No. Okay. There we go. Phone doesn't ring.
It's a little funny being a environmental reporter, because you have to remember that you have to, as Rich said, you have to have the reader in mind, as opposed to the people who are pitching you all the time. A lot of my job is batting away story ideas that people try to sell me on, basically. And actually, just today, I was working on a story. I thought this wasn't a story, but my editor wants me to write a story about it. Senator Charles Perry, who's here to talk later today, is going to talk here later today. Has just proposed some bills for a state flood control infrastructure project. And actually, the Tribune had a story about this too. And I don't know. It's so removed from on the state level. It's so removed from everyday human being life. Obviously, we've gone through a lot of devastating floods in Texas, but to write a story about the state taking this effort, I guess I'll be surprised if many people want to read that story about these bills that have been proposed for this, unless they're here at this conference. I'll bet the readership will be high here, but our readers on Palmer Lane, might not be as interested.
All right. I'm absolutely convinced the state water funding plan, which we editorialize a lot about, passed in 2013, but I'm absolutely convinced it passed because we had this record drought in 2011. So what's that line? Don't let it waste a good crisis or something. So it worked to our advantage. So, this is probably a question I'm going to ask on your behalf. So this is a field that can be characterized by a lot of arcane terminology, like acre feet. Although I will say, my friend Bill Mulligan, who's sitting out here, I hope this is true because I remember it being true, so if not, correct me later. We were talking one day on the phone, and we were talking about irrigation runoff and why we needed to be thinking differently about water conservation in the Panhandle and other places. And we're talking about irrigation. And he told me this story about being at a family farm in the Panhandle, I think it was, when you were a kid, and swimming in irrigation ditches with snakes and all.
Wow. And
the runoff. And I thought, bingo, that is great imagery. This is why we need to be concerned about conservation, so future Bill Mulligans don't have to swim in irrigation ditches with snakes, to humanize it somehow, which is different than acre feet. So this is not the only profession that wrestles with arcane terminology, but it can be a deal killer.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Well, I think one way that you mentioned acre feet. Acre feet is what we call a Migo term. My eyes glaze over. Think of another way to say the same thing. A column of water 12 feet high that covers a football field.
And there goes all the words from my editorial right there, but go ahead.
We all speak in a industry jargon, whatever our industry is. You have it, we have it. The five of us could get together over a couple bottles of wine and after 15 minutes, you probably wouldn't know what we're talking about because we lapse into our own jargon, even though we're communicators. And what I find is that industry jargon sometimes is pushed out there as kind of a way to show expertise, to protect yourself. It's kind of a tribal instinct. If you speak this language, you're a member of the tribe. And if you don't, you're not a member of the tribe. So drop all of that and try to think about conveying an idea to an intelligent friend who's not in your business or a member of the family. Somebody who is bright and understands issues and can grasp it, but use the language that they use or common language. Stay away from the passive voice, use an active voice. Stay away from abstractions and use concrete nouns. Don't talk about facilities, talk about buildings. Don't talk about facilities, talk about a pond or a pump or what have you. Stay away from lots of adjectives and verbs. Be specific. Use concrete nouns, numbers, things that convey some meaning. And then sit back and get somebody to edit what you're saying. Do you understand what I'm saying? And take that criticism and turn it into something that is a livelier transmission of news.
Corrie.
We're always trying to translate jargon into English, whether it's about healthcare policy or immigration policy or whatever it may be. We're trying to speak to an audience that doesn't just live and breathe the state capitol. So if we have a reference to acre feet in our stories, one way we might deal with that is we might put how many acre feet we mean, but then we might translate that to, that would be the same as 8% of the volume of Lake Travis near Austin. And maybe somebody would understand that a little better than the number of acre feet. So yeah, we're definitely trying to make it more, the language more approachable.
Right. So Stacy, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, we've learned from getting reporter inquiries, like, can you translate that into gallons for me? Oh, yeah. But even that can be really, once you get past, 10 gallons, it's hard to visualize. Yeah. So I've had some of the experts behind the scenes do little charts for us where they'll take a local landmark and do calculations for us and be like, oh, that'll fill that building 2 times, or that's 3 Dillon reservoirs, or that type of thing. So that's been one way to help translate it. And Rich, I love what you were just saying, because I feel like we've probably got a mix of engineers and operations folks in the room and maybe some communicators, and that balance of your communications people are probably going to be asking you a lot of questions and trying to get you to simplify it, and it's not because we're dumb, but it's to help really get it into terms that people might understand and relate to, and that's always a challenge, but to continue to challenge ourselves to break it down, keep it simple and specific.
So I'm interested in your site, if you could talk a little bit more about it, because you mentioned, I think, it's not press releases, it's not a marketing, I mean, obviously we know you're for Denver Water, you're not going to come out and say Denver Water is a bunch of fools or anything, so we got that. But when I read it, I thought this could be any place, and you're really telling interesting stories about what's going on there. And so talk a little bit how this came about, and is this a model you see anybody else using? Yeah, so
as the media person, I was feeling this pull between, you're always wanting to pitch stories to the media, but we would get enough inquiries that was really hard to sort of stay ahead of it. And so I actually was at a separate communications related conference where I heard this concept of kind of framing yourself and your organization as your own newsroom. And it really struck home with me, and I came back and I said, we have to do this. And so what we did was took a look at our existing staff that we had in public affairs, who really, not all of them were trained writers or communicators or reporters, but worked really over the course of a year to reframe and rethink how we can tell stories, and did a lot of work on the front end to get ourselves into that mindset. We have a little pitch sheet of our own where it says, like, kind of what you're saying, what's the tension, what's the conflict? We're not doing the story if we can't find that, to really try to be authentic. Of course, we get our own voice in the story, which is important, and if a news station picks it up, they'll often maybe find another voice or that type of thing, but it really took a concerted effort, and we structured our team, people who were identified as the writers or the content producers, my role as the managing editor, and then started having some consistent meetings. So we would meet daily, very briefly, but just to say, hey, what's happening? What's going on out there? We have this concept of newsjacking, where you take a topic that's out there in the news that people are talking about, people at home may be wondering, how does this water issue, pertain to me? And you sort of can summarize and then do, add a Denver water expert's voice on that to kind of do our take. So, okay, this is maybe what it means for folks in Colorado or in Denver area. So that structure, and then a weekly meeting where we were then actually assigning stories, talking through, brainstorming ideas, and assigning it to our folks and staffing up that way. I've been really fortunate in the past year. I've hired, we had vacancies on the team, and we filled them with people who had journalism backgrounds, which makes my life a lot easier, which is amazing. But we really take it seriously, because the media is not going to take us seriously if we're not credible.
We're going to have time for questions in just a minute, but let me ask this one, and then we can segue to that. There's a lot of conflict in water issues. In North Texas, there's big debates over where reservoirs are going. It is very heated. But one of our biggest conflicts, if you will, is going to be the rapid population growth of our state, the rapid population growth of Colorado, and as we look ahead, how do we provide enough water for people? This is a story with a lot of human drama. So, what do you hear from, if anything, from readers or leaders in your community about this issue? How you engage on that topic? Any thoughts?
One thing I'd say quickly is one of the big stories of last year, of course, was Hurricane Harvey. And in the aftermath of that, what came out of that was a lot of policy discussion, if you will, in Houston about how do we rebuild? Do we refill this prairie with starter homes? Do we build up and rebuild every home 3 feet? So a lot of those, how do we prepare for the future stories, come out of crises or catastrophes. And it's an opportunity for you, it's an opportunity for us as journalists.
I think it's really a competition story, the way these states are changing and the demand for water. And you see it in Central Texas, water suppliers, for example, want to pump groundwater from points east of Austin and ship it. So then you have a property rights question and who's going to get the water, who's paying for the water, and those water suppliers are also in competition with each other. So there's a competition question. There's a conservation story. I mean, water. Per capita water consumption has gone down actually in a lot of parts of Texas. So even as the state is growing, water demand overall isn't necessarily increasing. So and that then gets into this much wider story about building reservoirs versus conservation. There's also a technology story. I personally am not as good as I ought to be writing the technology story, but how we're going to convert our, the zombie toilet water thing, like how we're going to use our toilet water, how we're going to clean it and then re-drink it is another side of the story as well.
Right. I was really struck with something you said earlier. You approached this like you're a foreign correspondent and trying to interpret this for people back home. That's interesting.
Well, I think it's a helpful way, and this may be true of non-journalists too. When you're trying to think about what a story might look like, is think about that job of a foreign correspondent, where you're reporting on a far-flung place and even the strange customs of that place, but you're coming to it with hopefully fresh eyes, and so it makes whatever those customs are and what our policies are more interesting. It's also a way to think about these things culturally rather than just in terms of politics and what's going on at the Capitol. So there's a bit of a garbled answer, but I think you get the idea.
Right. And I recall when I first started writing about water issues, which I knew absolutely zero about, in 2000 I went up to the Panhandle to research some of you may recall Boone Pickens was buying up water rights there. And so I went up to just write editorials and columns. And I remember driving across the Panhandle, going to different communities, just thinking, this is absolutely fascinating.
Exactly.
And that's your foreign correspondent.
Yes,
I was thinking
exactly.
about people back in Dallas and Texas who don't know any of this. I didn't know it. And
Right.
going to hear from communities and their take on, water rights in their area and how people were trying to conserve water differently.
Right, and you're meeting actual human beings
it was
too. I mean, to
fascinating.
go back to what other people were saying, you're one of the benefits of being on the road is you get to scene set, as
Right.
Rich said earlier, and talk to people, as Corrie said, and so on. So.
Right. Yeah. No. And I guess that's what I would encourage our audience to be thinking about. You all are on the ground and see what you see and how you communicate that. So I can't see as well, but if there are questions, we're game to hear from you. Any acre feet people out there who want to talk. All right.
Hello, thank you for the great comments so far. So there's lessons in excess, so flood control, flood mitigation. But I think what we're talking about long-term is lessons in scarcity. And I guess what I see from my business in terms of water conservation solutions, during these times, interest just falls down. And I guess I'm trying to ask, what are ways to bring stories of scarcity and make them topical in times like now where, why should we worry about water conservation when all the lakes in Texas are full? So I guess what strategies to bring those scarcity into times like now? So thank you.
Thoughts?
I'll give you one example of how a water story became topical, and it was we related it to the person at the center of the news, it seems, every day, Donald Trump. After the wall was announced or pursued, intensified, Melissa Del Bosque, who writes for us, found this place in Starr County where she determined that if the wall was built there, parts of Starr County would flood. People's homes would be washed away, and agricultural lands, grazing lands, and so on both sides of the river, if that wall was erected, because it would prevent the waters from moving in. So that was a current political issue that was used to tie, water was used, it was tied to that. To the extent that yesterday a state representative has introduced a bill calling for a study and advocacy against the construction of the wall in Starr County. So those, keep thinking about what's going on in the news, what you read, that may be totally unrelated directly to water, but indirectly it may have some real consequence. And it's newsy. It's in the news.
It's funny you should bring that up because somebody I work with keeps bringing this story up. Has brought it up several times.
I would just add, I encourage you all to develop relationships with your local reporters, because you might want to go out to coffee and say, here are some things, I have my ear to the ground, here are some things you, reporter, ought to know about, maybe that may or may not be related to your business, but are related to water stuff in general. And that puts a bug in my ear also about what's, about maybe what you're seeing, but more with the broader landscape. And I'll give you my cell phone number is 512-417-8200. Asher Price, 512-417-8200.
I'll dial it right now.
So you can always text me and and introduce yourself, or aprice@statesman.com, and say and again, the just briefly, if you hear about some piece of legislation is being pushed around, for example, flooding or whatever, and you think I just ought to know that certain advocacy groups have been meeting with the senator or have been giving campaign contributions or so on and so forth, that there might be just a story there. Or you know the expression astroturfing. You know, this happens in environmental stuff too, where you have an environmental group promotes some kind of plan. I don't know, like Sierra Club some years ago was promoting, had an anti-coal campaign, and then it turned out a lot of the money came from natural gas companies that were in competition with the coal group. So that's something I wrote about. That's an interesting story, and that probably versions of that happen in the water world as well. And so I'm just throwing that out there as things that you ought to think about that might interest me in the newsroom.
And I would just add, maybe just thinking about like data points or trends over time. If there's something that you can put together that then you can maybe tell a graphic story about that to get people's attention. I think a lot of times, you know, we have these points in time, but sometimes the information from over time can tell us, saying, hey, we're actually seeing more frequent floods or more frequent droughts, way different than it was, you know, a decade ago or more. And then why should I care? Well, this is then the you know, takeaway. So that's just one other factor I think I would add to that conversation.
You know, as I was listening to your question, I'm personally intrigued and have written about people who are really doing ranching and farming differently. And this kind of gets to your scarcity question. And I think some of the most interesting pieces, along with going the Panhandle, has been to go out and, you know, interview and write about people who are doing ranching differently or farming differently and how they're doing that. And that isn't directly, you know, the next day news story about scarcity, but it's people who realize we can't keep doing the same thing over and over again. In the journal I edited at the Bush Institute, we're looking into an issue in the future dealing kind of broadly about caring for the planet, or however you want to phrase it. But this is something we've talked about, how to go out and find places that are really doing this differently. Because that's this conservation thing, you know, you brought up is all tied into the scarcity. Yes, ma'am. Over here.
Hello, Christina Montoya, El Paso Water. I'm the Communications and Marketing Manager there. And we've talked a lot about drought and conservation. But one of the things we have a challenge telling the story, and I'm sure many other utilities do as well, is when we have to raise rates. And something we find challenges with pitching to outlets is the need to invest in infrastructure, which I know is probably not the right word to use, our pipes and plants. But I'm wondering what suggestions you have that we can use to pitch to our media outlets on how to cover, this is such an important story, the cost of water to get it to you, and why we need to invest to ensure that that resource is there for the future, not only in terms of aging pipes and plants, but also water supply. These new water supply solutions that we're looking to, like potable reuse, are going to cost more than just taking water out of the ground. So I know you talked about using people, but I'm curious of your ideas of how we can get that story out that people need to hear.
Hike prices. How do you report on that?
I mean, my first question would be, why are the rates going up?
Well, we've been charging too little for water for very long, and many utilities put off water increases in rates and deferred a lot of maintenance. That may be not the only reason. I don't want to generalize for everyone, but there are many factors. One of the ones that I just said also for water supply, we're looking at building a direct potable reuse facility in a few years, and that costs much more to produce that water, like I said, than taking it just out of the ground, but it's a more sustainable supply for the future. So those things are going to cost more, and that's where we need to communicate that to our customers so they understand why the cost is going to go up.
Well, this may be class warfare, but we were benefited at the Dallas Morning News editorial page to have some consumers who, in the middle of the drought, replenished their swimming pools quite often, or were constantly watering their yards in big volumes, or one particular instance, it was a huge fountain that this person had running. And in so many words, you can make the case that, I don't know how you put it, but in effect, shouldn't those people be paying more? And that we should be paying amount of water we use. I think something like that resonates with people. Again, I'm not into class warfare, but it was on the front page of the paper, and it kind of helped make your case for you.
I would add too, I don't know if there are actual visual projects that you can point to. I feel like that's a good news hook, is like, hey, this thing that's happening here is for a good reason, and here's where it's going to get you. So I feel like that the visual component, whether it's print or video or anything like that, tends to get people's attention. Or if it's a disruptive project in someone's neighborhood, that's the kind of well, hey, this is disruptive, but this is ensuring your water supply for the next 50 years, or those types of things. That's been successful, at least in our market.
All right.
The only thing I would add is just be upfront with the numbers. When trying to communicate this to your local reporter, think about having helpful graphics that explain all these things. But what I mean is be upfront about, if you use this much water, your bill's going to increase from here to here. And then presumably you'll have good arguments for why you're raising the rates. I mean, that's part of your job, I guess. So, but I wouldn't try to, downplay or hide anything, because it'll come out anyway.
And talk about corroding pipes, and talk about water that will run brown from your faucets if the bond issue doesn't pass or the rates aren't increased. Put it in those visual, concrete forms that people can see, smell, taste. It can be done, and that's the story when you do that.
We got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Is there another question? Yes. Here we go.
I actually don't have a question, but I'm going to take the liberty of making a statement, and I hope that all of the panelists will receive this as a gratitude and appreciation and respect for the work, really important work that you do. Tomorrow, this conference is going to end with a panel on groundbreaking landmark water legislation, Senate Bill 1 to HB 4. And as a former legislative staffer, I can tell you that 2 pieces of legislation that we're going to talk about tomorrow would not have been enacted into law but for Bill McKenzie.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm honored.
Nobody has done more to educate Texans about water in a thoughtful, artful, accurate way than Bill McKenzie. Carmen will back me up on that. I know Bill Mulligan and Blaine will too. Your work, your former work, your historic work, and your future work is as important as the work that the members of the legislature carrying those bills do. So thank you. And Asher, I don't love Bill more, just longer.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm honored. Anybody else?
Over here.
Thank you. Thank y'all very much for some great comments, but I have to, my name's Mike O'Connell. I'm Gulf Coast Water Authority from Galveston County, and I live in Fort Bend County myself, but I've noticed an absence of much discussion. I've said this in other forums today, that there's very little talk about the Gulf Coast or East Texas, Port Arthur, Tyler, Beaumont, Galveston, Houston, all that. Except, Corrie, you had a long list of things that you talked about our region. And every one of them were negative. And we're used to that. The media in this country has tried to take Houston down for many years. They failed, and we don't even worry about it anymore. And I'm not asking you for any kind of positive stories next year. I'm just saying that Houston was not unprepared for an act of God like we received. The statement was made where we were grossly unprepared, and that's what I object to. Now, nobody's going to spend the money to be prepared for something that's never happened before in the last 1,000 years. They're just not going to do it. And that's the position that we were caught in. And now, maybe you could write a story about the wonderful work that's been done since Harvey, and it's phenomenal. I don't know if y'all know that or not, but it's amazing. And no matter what the national media tried to do about Houston and as far as its investment potential and worthiness, it hadn't worked, because your own paper, Mr. Oppel, your magazine, you might recall this past edition, which city had 5 out of the top 10 sales last year in master communities? Do you know?
I didn't catch the last part of what you said.
5 out of your 10 top sales communities with the top amount of sales, 5 of those were in Houston, statewide. So the point I'm making is that Harvey was bad, but we moved on from that. And yet I've come to my own state and not too far north of where we live, and this is what I hear. And so I had to stand up and hopefully correct the record. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Well, I want to thank our fellow panelists here. Thank you all for attending. I guess our walkaway line is keep it simple, keep the stories, keep it human. Think about how you're talking to your neighbor over the fence. Put it negatively, you're not trying to speak to your peers. You're trying to speak to the broader public. But you got a very important issue, and obviously a critical resource. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.